Larry covered most of chapter 2. We'll look at just a few things of that. Verses 19, I think Larry said it had gotten to this last section. And uh, just one point on the material that Larry had covered over was the star and uh, its appearance. There are there are those who do not believe the inspiration of the Bible that tries to take away from the inspiration of scriptures and say that this was just and started the rest of their journey. And we know that what Herod had asked them to do, which was wrong. We'll see that the star appears again. And so I think that clearly shows us, and of course we believe that anyhow, but that clearly shows that it was inspired and it was miraculous. That is the star, because otherwise, if it would have been an astronomical event, it usually just, if it's um, some kind of something out in the universe that's extra bright, for some reason it would have and wouldn't have been there anymore. But it also finally guides them there specifically to where Jesus was. So this clearly shows us that this was miraculous. It just wasn't an astronomical event, but it was something supernatural, something beyond mankind, because the second appearance, I think, clearly shows us that it was something more than that. Okay, whoops.
Mike, in my studies on this, it said that history said that there was nothing recorded at this time about any meteorites or anything in the sky unusual. Just in my opinion, from studying through this and reading it, that this star probably appeared primarily to these wise men, and it certainly was a miraculous thing, and it stood still over where Jesus was. Now we know a meteor couldn't do that. So, but history recorded nothing, and they went back, and a lot of these people have tried to prove that this was just one of those things that happened, but it's not recorded as such. It had to be miraculous.
Yeah, this is maybe something not normal that we would think about or hear, and so it's something I think we need to be aware of as Christians, because we know there's atheists, agnostics, those that disbelieve the Bible, and they can't have a miracle. Virgin birth, I'm sure, was not a miracle to them either, because they want to discredit the Bible. It appeared a second time. It's very obvious that this was miraculous. It's very obvious that God was guiding them specifically there to the place that Jesus was born. And it's, you just think about all of it. Uh, they were told to flee, uh, and Herod killed all the children 2 years of age and younger, simply because he had inquired of the wise men when they seen the star. And that kind of got me thinking too. 2 years. Does that mean that this process of them traveling there uh, took that long of time? You just kind of wonder, or if they saw it and waited for a while to come when it appeared. If it appeared other times, uh, we're given and sometimes it's difficult for us, and we need to always keep in mind with the Bible, historically especially, we're giving little snapshots. Not every single thing that occurs is recorded. Obviously, we'd have to have the Bible on a cart to carry it around. You couldn't have a pocket version of it, to say the least. You'd have to have several of them because it would be so thick and so full. So we're only left to amaze. Perhaps, maybe, I can't imagine that they traveled for 2 years I would just say, I don't know, but one thought might be that Herod wanted to make sure that he killed the king. So if it had been 6 months or something, he might have thought, well, from 2 years of old age and younger, he would slay them. I don't know if, because we see when they come to see Jesus, he's in a house. They haven't fled yet. They haven't gone to Egypt, as we'll see. And this is the process after this. And then they come back. And then eventually, as we know, they end up in Nazareth. Now, uh, it's possible, I don't know, but it's possible that after the birth of Jesus in the manger, that a place opened up for her to be there, a house. And so there's some questions on that too. Uh, but once again, the wise man appears and sees the Lord. They're told in the vision, and this is amazing too. These wise men, it's really difficult to know. We're not told, but I would clearly think that they were Jews that were part of the dispersion that we talked about all over the world under the Assyrian Empire, and perhaps the East would be either out of China or out of the other one escaped me. Uh, Arabia, some suggested Persia, Arabia. It could be from India. So otherwise, trying to think of it was the East, it says. So we just don't know exactly where they were from. But being that they listened to an angel that was in a dream and they responded to come and see the Messiah and worship him, it almost, to me at least, I think it would be easy to conclude that they were Jews who were dispersed. And I wouldn't think of the Gentiles as being that they didn't have these revelations. I wouldn't think of a Gentile being that interested or even thinking about it, although some suggest that perhaps they could be Gentiles. But we just really don't know to that. But the prophecy in Jeremiah that the weeping in Bethlehem, and that's very interesting too. It's only just a short period, distance away from Jerusalem. Uh, so we see all these events, and the thing that we can observe as we go through, many of the prophecies, as we've already talked about, are fulfilled in Jesus. You see the Gospels. These prophecies are used to very proof that Jesus was the Messiah. But there's also a lot of scripture that is referred to in the Gospels that kind of clarifies what was spoken about in the Old Testament. Sometimes you read those things and you wonder if that's all we had, you would wonder what is it talking about? What event is it talking about? Uh, and some of these things are clarified. I think when we get into the Beatitudes, I think the Lord probably clarified some teachings there, and of course, introduced, I think, the difference between the old. So we see all these events, and this kind of fills us in, if you please. That's certainly the importance of the Gospels, is that the 400 silent years that we see that's recorded, and then the Gospels kind of brings all this together. After 400 years, the Jews were bad during the prophets, and as Larry finished up the minor prophets, the Jews, at least a large portion of them, had already rejected God as king. They started accepting idols. So you can only imagine how less they would have known 400 years later. And so we see them with Christ, and we'll see them as we go through. And obviously, their lack of understanding, the keeping of the law became more of a thing of pride and arrogance. Didn't the heart that should have been there. The New Testament talks about the heart and the spiritual man. Uh, those things are talked about in the Old Testament, not as clearly perhaps, but they are talked about in the Old Testament. But for the Jews, it became a legalistic matter. And so, as long as I kept this law and this law and this law and this law, then I was a righteous, moral man. Remember the rich man. And it says he was asked to give away his money and come and follow Christ, and he was very wealthy and he couldn't do that. But he was excited because of the fact, well, I've kept all those from my youth up. So you just see him marking things off. And so this is mainly the law of Moses. Now, concurrently during the law of Moses was the patriarchal law that was existence. Jesus lived and died under the Old Testament. We need to realize that too. And it ran concurrently. There were some things that were in the law of Moses that I think those under the patriarchal knew also. Sacrifices required of them. Abraham was a patriarch and not under the Mosaical dispensation, and he offered sacrifices. So we see sacrifices. We see some of the things in the law of Moses every once in a while in our history in the Gentile nation. But once again, remember, it's just a snapshot. It's not the whole thing. As we mentioned before, because of the scheme of redemption that God had planned out for us. So this is the occasion that we see. And then in verses 19 through 21, where we had stopped off, Larry mentioned, we see Herod's death and Jesus' return. And this is one commentator that I put there for everyone to look at. Certainly free to look at others and come across with things, but Herod was very, I can't think of the word I would want. He was very devious. He was very jealous. He did not want anybody to take over his throne. He was hungered with power, and I believe, like I mentioned, I believe this is the one. I should have checked further, but I believe this is the one that killed some of his own children to keep them from ascending to the throne. And so we see the character of Herod, and like I mentioned, it's really strange. People who get into a position like that, evidently the authority as we say, goes to their head, because Herod obviously didn't conclude that he was going to die anyhow if somebody was going to take his throne. So really, no matter what he did, it was rather frivolous because of the fact that he was going to die. I think about Xi and Putin and even some of our leaders that are doing things that obviously some of them are going to be dead long before, even our president's going to be dead long before some of the things he's trying to do ever comes to pass. And it's just like, I don't know, I guess it's the power. And so Herod was very power struck. But this mentions here that he was visited and with grievous wounds. They were petrified, they bred worms, and his whole body was so horribly offensive that no one would approach him. And I'm not sure how they found that other than historically or through the historical records. Doesn't necessarily mention it in the scriptures. But if indeed that's true, it almost seems like a just judgment of a man who would kill his own family members, his male family members, because he was jealous and afraid that they were going to take the throne away from him. When you look at the true history of kings and monarchs through our history, I just personally would never want to be one. They had to have tasters to make sure that somebody wasn't poisoning them. They always had to be thinking, well, who's going to deceive me or do this to take over my throne? certainly it would not have been a particularly interesting place to be. But the angel announced to Joseph the death of Herod, and Joseph then was told to go back to Israel. Now, Archelaus became king after Herod's death, and we see that Joseph was afraid of him. He was afraid to go because of this individual. He was a son of Herod and probably had good reason to fear him. He is what they call a tetrarch. Matthew 14, verse 1. If somebody has a Bible, we can look at a few of these verses that mentions about this. Matthew 14, verse 1.
At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus.
So the word tetrarch is not a king, but is, I suppose it would probably compare to our governors. Larry, you're going to say something.
They broke his kingship or his area down into three different segments, and that's what history says made it a tetrarch. Was when they broke it down into small, like you're saying, governors.
Yeah.
His three sons took over each one of those, and this one Archelaus took over the area where Joseph was coming back to. He evidently had the same personality as Herod.
Yeah. So he was not. Luke 3:1, 9:7, and Acts 13:1 are other passages that refers to this idea. And like I say, it could be translated a governor, as he was not a king as Herod. As Larry mentioned, it was divided up. That was another thing that drove Herod to do the things that he did. And the other Herods that come along was not only that fear, but also Rome itself. They were afraid of Rome. They were afraid of the people rebelling against them. And that's when we see the beginning of the gospel, our Lord's ministry, and his crucifixion. They were afraid that the Romans would come and transplant him, and that seems to be what the Romans would do if a ruler kind of was weak and wasn't effective as they should be. They just come and bring soldiers and take them and put them somewhere else, or kill them, or put them in a prison somewhere, and set somebody up for them. And as we went through the Old Testament, we'd seen that there's occasions too in the Old Testament where the same things happen with some of the persecutions. So this is the reason Joseph dwelt in the city of Galilee, and this was to fulfill prophecies. And this is a difficult one, and if you got any better answers, feel free to share them with us. But he was called a Nazarene. The references that I had gone over, there's nowhere in the Old Testament that calls him a Nazarene, or uses the word Nazarene, I'm sorry. And the scriptures that I put down here are the ones that refer to the Nazarite vow. And let's go back to Numbers chapter 6. The interesting thing of this Nazarite vow, it seemed to be that it was a vow that someone would take, but once it was fulfilled, then they could also stop doing it. It didn't seem to be a long-term thing. It seemed to be more of a vow that somebody would make, and then they would fulfill that vow. In Numbers 6, we see it laid out as to how it was. We also see what happens when somebody does something that they shouldn't, and the process that they have to go through to meet their obligation and provide sacrifices. We see this in Judges, Lamentations, and Amos. And like I said, there's some commentators that I checked and they said this is what it is. The one thing that would come to my mind is the fact the Lord turning the water into wine. They're not to touch wine or grapes or any products come from grapes. And then the Lord's Supper, which was instituted with the fruit of the vine. So it doesn't seem that he would fit the idea that he took the Nazarite vow. Number 6 and verse 2 says, "Speak to the children of Israel, say to them, when either a man or a woman consecrates an offering to take the vow of a Nazarite to separate himself to the Lord." So we see that it's either man or woman could do this. And all the days, going on down to, verse 3, "He shall separate himself from wine made from wine, or vinegar made from similar drinks, neither shall he drink any grape juice, nor eat fresh grapes or raisins. All the days of his separation he shall eat nothing that is produced by the grapeskin or grapevine from seed to skin." And then the next is the razor. "And the days of the vows of his separation, no razor shall come upon his head until the days are fulfilled for which he separated himself to the Lord. He shall be holy. Then he shall let the locks of his hair, the locks of the hair of his head grow." Who do we know that in the Old Testament time that would have fit this Nazarite vow? Samson. Remember, he finally betrayed himself, and his hair was cut, and he became weak. The vow was broken, but they could not do that. All the days, verse 6 goes on down, "All the days that he has separated himself to the Lord, he shall not go near a dead body. He shall not make himself unclean, even for his father or his mother, for his brother or his sister, when they die, because his separation to God is on his head. All the days of his separation he shall be holy to the Lord." And so that kind of indicates that they could take a vow for a period of time, then they could offer the sacrifices that we see later on. It talks about what he needs to do. Verse 9, "If anyone dies very suddenly beside him, and he defiles his consecrated head, then he shall shave his head on the day of his cleansing. On the 7th day he shall shave it. Then on the 8th day he shall bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons to the priest to the door of the tabernacle of the meeting. And the priest shall offer one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering, and make atonement for him, because he has sinned in regard to the corpse, and he has sanctified his head that same day." And it goes on to explain then the processes of sacrifice and what they had to offer. And then, of course, once all of that was done, the priest offered a wave offering. There was offering and sacrifices. Then in verse 21, at the end of this, it says, "This is the law of the Nazarite who vows to the Lord the offering for his separation." So it's possible to make it. It's possible to be separated from it. And besides that, whatever else his hand is able to provide according to the vow which he takes, so he must do according to the law of his separation. So it was set a price that he would be called a Nazarene. And as I mentioned, there's nowhere any reference that I found that uses in the Old Testament him being called a Nazarene. The only thing that I found, and I wonder, it says the prophets, and so it's really difficult. Maybe somebody else can come up with a better answer. But Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1, as I mentioned, many use this Nazarite thing, and that doesn't seem to, like I said, that doesn't seem to fit, especially when he instituted the Lord's Supper, and then he used the fruit of the vine, which would have been a violation. That would have been a sin, because it said it was a sin to do so. For him to have anything related to that, And of course, he raised dead bodies too, right? So there was that. So there are certain things that would disqualify him, and we know that he hadn't sinned. Uh, Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1, this is what one had come up with. And the word came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, hear the words of this covenant, and speak to the Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. That's not the one that I would want. Let me see if I can find that. That must be wrong in the... Yeah, Micah 5, I'm sorry, is one that had found that some suggest indicates perhaps this idea of the Nazarene. And Micah chapter 5, verses 2 through 4. It says, but you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from old to everlasting. Therefore he shall give them up until the time that she who is in labor has given birth. Then the remnant of his brethren shall return to the children of Israel. And then it goes on. And so this idea of Bethlehem and the fact of his birth and is by some the question of be called the Nazarene. Anyone else in their study come up with anything other?
Well, there's a difference between being a Nazarene because you're from Nazareth and taking on the Nazarite vow. Not everybody in that. Not everybody from Nazareth would take that Nazarite vow. So I'm not sure he I don't know that he took the vow. Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's suggested the one that they wanted why he was called a Nazarene because he took the Nazarite vow, but I don't think that's so.
No, it's like we're American. We're from here. That's how I've always understood it. He didn't. Now, some of the references, like Judges 13, it kind of alludes to. He uses the word Nazarite. I don't know how that plays into it, but Judges 13 and 5 says, for lo, thou shalt conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come on his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite unto God, and the woman shall begin to deliver Israel out of the Philistines.
Is that the one that refers to Samson?
That's Judges 13 and 5. Yeah. I haven't read the whole section.
Yeah, some of them I came up with was Numbers, Judges 13, 5 through 25, Lamentations 4, 7, and Amos 2, 11 and 12. Now, the Micah and that the idea of being small and coming out of Bethlehem, there are other references such as Mark 1:24, Luke 4:34, Acts 22:8, Acts 2:22, 3:6, and 10:38 that uses the expression Christ or the apostles uses him Jesus the Nazarene. And so it seems to be used as a reference point. For what reference, I really don't know. It said the prophets said that he would be from Nazareth, and
Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is I don't know that Judges 13 is a messianic prophecy.
Right, I agree. Yeah.
It would be more distinctive of those that would take that vow versus somebody born in the city or of Nazareth or from Nazareth, not from the region.
Yeah, Hannah dedicated her firstborn to the Lord. And of course, I don't know that we know that he was that taken the Nazarite, that there were those who children were consecrated to service in the temple. But I just verse 23 of the second chapter says, "And he came and dwelt in the city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene." That's the difficult part. Where are the prophets? It's the Nazarene is not mentioned in the Old Testament at all. So, it's most that I've understood is that he's from Nazareth, and this is why he would call it a Nazarene, anyone from Nazareth. But perhaps because of Bethlehem being a small place, maybe something great came out of it, and he called himself the Nazarene, but then that traces back to Bethlehem and the fact that he was the Messiah was great, and something great came out of Bethlehem, even though it was not considered significant. But neither was Nazareth considered someplace specific or important either. Larry, you were going to say something
I
about
was just gonna say, my Bible had another reference there to John 1:45 and 46, and on the Nazarene, and in these two verses, it refers to Jesus of Nazareth. Instead of a Nazarene, they called him, his location where he was raised, Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah, and like I said, the reference I ran, it says it's not in the Old Testament. So it says it was the prophets. What Matthew is including here, I just don't know for certain. I guess it's just one of those scriptures that is really very difficult to say.
The only explanation I can think of is they would have known that, not every word or testimony or prophecy, or not every word or testimony from a prophet was memorialized in his writing.
Yeah.
Prophets, I guess you're on the record all day. The prophets may have spoken of it, but they didn't write about it.
Yeah.
So, when it might have been handed down that through tradition or through just basically handing it down that Micah or any of the prophets had spoken that, because it does say it was spoken, not written. So it's hard to find, like you said, it's hard to find in the Old Testament a record of him, of this prophecy. But, I think the distinction has to be made between the Nazarene and Nazarite. I mean, it feels natural to me to say he was a Nazarene because he moved to Nazareth. The only question is where in the Old Testament prophecy is it? We don't know that it's written down.
Well, I'd say I think it's more impressive that, in the Old Testament, it talks about Bethlehem. That's much more specific than Nazareth.
Yeah.
And so the Messianic prophecy is very specific. It names the exact place where the Messiah would be born. The fact that, it's easy to know that Bethlehem is in Nazareth. It's in that region, it's in that area. So I think the prophecy is much more specific than, it doesn't mention Nazareth. Well, to me, that's kind of a given.
Yeah, it certainly it could be that. It could be the fact, as Ron mentioned, not all prophecy was written down. This could have been an oral tradition passed down from one generation to another. But it doesn't seem to come up till this time. That's what's a little confusing to try to pull it all together as to why this particular thing and why it says the prophets plural as opposed to a prophet. So.
Well, I was just going to say, if you say that I was born in Marietta, you don't have to say that I was born in Ohio.
Right.
Because Marietta is in Ohio. And so even the prophets saying, that he'd be a Nazarene, well, they did, in that, they they said the specific place where he was, which is in that region, so to me, it's still kind of to me, it's still a given.
I think the thing that sticks in my mind is the fact that even Matthew isn't saying that he took the Nazarite vow.
No, I don't think that's.
And that, and, and like some of the references that sometimes we see in our Bible, like verse 23, my Bible has Judges 13:5, which takes you that, and sometimes those create more confusion than clarity. And I think that's what it's doing here in some of the references that we find in our Bibles, that it's confusing Nazarene and Nazarite, and there's no indication that Christ did that based on your initial discussion on through the vine and all those other things. It says you weren't supposed to get near a dead body, not let alone touch it if you took the Nazarite vow. And he was pretty close to Lazarus, and he said, "Get up." So a lot of things, but sometimes our references can create more confusion. And I think taking it back to Judges 13 is kind of inconsistent.
Yeah,
Had Jesus
Good.
taken the Nazarite vow, I think it would be very, I'm sure he would follow that vow precisely, which we don't see that anywhere in his lifestyle at all.
and the Jews would have known the Nazarite vow, and I don't think there would have been any confusion as far as Matthew was concerned that he was a Nazarite. But one commentator did, that was his idea, that he was a Nazarite, but as we see in Numbers, he would have broken that vow, and it says very specifically if they did that with the grape and the vine or whatever, it would be a sin, and they would have to offer sin sacrifices. They had to offer some of the same sacrifices that those who sinned would have to offer to cover their sins, and we know Christ didn't sin. So that's a confusing. Another thing, and just then we get to the questions. Jesus had siblings. He had brothers, but don't know that in the Testament they were called Nazarenes. So this is really a kind of a confusing one. Either as Kim's suggesting that it's close to the area, and this is why it's spoken about, because there are several scriptures in the New Testament that talks about Jesus of Nazareth, as if it was something that the people then would have known. Jesus of Nazareth, or the Nazarene, that seemed to be a common thing. And as Larry mentioned out, you look at the Gospels, even in the book of Acts, references made to Jesus of Nazareth or Nazarene. Richard?
Well, you notice they didn't have a last name then.
No,
And
no.
so that's how they differentiated between the different people named Jesus as to where they came from. Because it was not a unique name. There were other people named Jesus.
And like it could be Jesus, the son of Joseph. Of course, he wasn't the physical son of Joseph. This was his stepfather. But there was a lot of Josephs too. So it would really get confusing because there's no last name. That's certainly why we could see that last names were very, very important. They help us in our time because we could make distinctions where you have millions and millions of people, and after a while, names start to getting repeated, and so, as Richard mentioned, there's no last names. Why the Nazarene? I don't know. It seems, if you go through the New Testament, it seems to identify Jesus specifically. So, those I think probably are to me, the two important options. Either the prophet spoke and it was passed down in oral tradition, or it was somewhere close in the same area, and that's why he was called that. It seems to distinguish him from anyone else, too, in their preaching, that he was called this Nazarene. So I think that's about, unless somebody else has a better idea, that seems to be, I think, what seems to be the most reasonable about this. And I don't know, I did not find anything where it said it was a translation problem. So sometimes Hebrew words, just like Greek words, there's sometimes a translation problem. Uh, the Greek text of the Testament, or the Koine Greek, which the New Testament mainly was written in Arabic also, uh, but the Greek was very specific. In English, we're not that particular specific. And sometimes from the Greek text to the English text, you'll read it word for word in the Greek text. There's like, I have a Nestle's text that literally puts down the word of the particular Greek word. And it's not in the form that we speak. And so to translate it from Greek to English, there has to be some reconstruction in the sentences too. And so that's confusing for us too. Any other questions or comments? We're about out of time. Maybe catch a couple questions here and finish them next time then. What prophet prophesied of Jesus' birth, and where is it? There might be more than one.
As we say, Isaiah did in 7:14, I think it was. And Micah did in terms of where
Yeah.
is to be born.
Yeah, Micah 5:2 specifically Bethlehem, and Isaiah the virgin birth.
Yeah, we looked at in chapter 1, the virgin birth.
Yeah.
Was prophesied.
Number 2 then, where did the wise men come from? We mentioned that also this way.
Just the
From the east. Where from the east, we don't seem to know. We're not told. We're not told if they're Jews or Gentiles. Like I said, to me, it seemed to be more reasonable that they were Jews of the dispersion. Them knowing about the Messiah and the birth and all of this, and then going to Herod and asking the questions of Herod, who was supposed to also be a Jew, or at least a half Jew, and then the priest and all those others asked. It would almost seem to me that they were Jewish. Richard.
Just one thing I was gonna add to this, though. The wise men went to the king. Not everybody got to go to the king and ask anything. So they had to be somebody that had connections and were respected as leaders or something.
Yeah.
So he would gotten to that position.
Yeah, and we had mentioned about what the wise men sometimes just people of knowledge, of great wisdom, some maybe even a little bit higher class of people, but that we really don't know that much either. Once again, it's because this has to do with the scheme of redemption, the introduction of Christ in his birth, and the fact that he's fulfilled these prophecies and he is the Messiah. And when we get to another one too, which is perhaps I guess it'll be in the next chapter. So actually, the reference of Luke talks about the fact that Jesus and his parents went to Jerusalem every year for the feast of the Passover. And so we know of his birth, we know when he was 12, but we don't know anything from his birth to 12 or from 12 to about 30 when he began his ministry. But they went to Jerusalem and they would go in great crowds, go back in great crowds. Uh, and so I found it interesting. To me, a thought would be that here God brought the Messiah, and these things that we're talking about here in the second chapter 2, I think, alludes to this, that he was in their midst and he wasn't hidden by any means from them. And yet they didn't know him. He was right there in his midst, and they did not even know that he was the Messiah except for Mary and Joseph and perhaps Elizabeth, and then Simeon and Anna, I believe it was, were told when he was brought to Jerusalem that this was the Messiah. He was the Messiah. But I find it interesting that God brought the Messiah in the world, and they're all looking for him, and there he was in the midst of them, and they never recognized him. So in a sense, God hid him in plain sight, which shows certainly the inspiration of God. So any other question or comment? We're a little past time. Thanks everybody for their participation this morning.